the affordability crisis is a real problem. When oil is between $60 and $90, people in Texas are like, thumbs up, this is great news. When oil is $110 a barrel, they get nervous because people start to switch and people start to drive EVs and stuff like that. What we have now is the equivalent of oil at like $150, and people are rapidly finding alternatives, and it's making utilities really nervous.
It has been a rough summer for soft-serve ice cream enthusiasts. In most parts of the United States, hot and humid weather has visited and overstayed its welcome, which is no treat for the power grid either. Elevated temperatures mean increased electricity consumption and accompanying higher prices, the cherry on top amidst a nationwide surge in demand fueled by data centers, manufacturing, and mass electrification. So far, we've seen grid operators issue a few alerts and calls for conservation, primarily in constrained PJM, where emergency conservation measures likely kept electricity demand from eclipsing an all-time high set back in 2006. Down in Texas, the record book is being rewritten this summer. ERCOT has shattered its all-time demand mark more than once, but managed to keep power prices reasonable by leveraging an influx of renewables and battery energy storage to break generation records, too. In general, serving peak demand is extremely expensive, and the peakier the system, the pricier it is for the average ratepayer. As most of the country copes with higher electricity bills, finding ways to curb costs is paramount. Thankfully, utilities have a variety of tools at their disposal to improve grid utilization and peak load management, including flexible home electrical equipment, smart electric vehicle charging, and managing distributed energy resources through virtual power plants. And since transmission and distribution system infrastructure is designed to accommodate the few hours of the year where the system is taken to its limits, there is almost always spare capacity on power lines, which can be leveraged via advanced transmission technologies, or ATTs, as we discussed in the previous episode of the Factor This Policycast. In this edition of the podcast, presented once again in partnership with Advanced Energy United, we explored demand-side solutions for surviving summer peaks. We're going to talk about the tools available to keep our lights on and bills manageable, and how utilities can use them to get more out of our existing grid without investing in costly, time-consuming infrastructure upgrades. Richard Caperton, Vice President for Public Policy at SPAN, and Sarah Steinberg, Managing Director at Advanced Energy United, will outline the metrics that matter. They'll share how early legislation is leaning and explain why demand-side solutions work for utilities and, quite frankly, all of us. Let's start with the names in your program. Sarah, we'll begin with you, and then we'll kick it over to Richard. Can you please tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself and the perspective that you bring to the topic at hand?
Hi, Paul. Thanks so much. Great to be here with you. My name's Sarah Steinberg. I am an ice cream enthusiast.
I'm glad you picked up what I was throwing down there. Thank you.
I'm a managing director at Advanced Energy United. I sit on our policy and market intelligence team. Been with the organization for coming up on 7 years. Time flies. And these days I am supporting several of our work streams, including distributed energy resource programs and virtual power plants, electrifying transportation, enabling building electrification, and transmission. So all super relevant to this conversation. To give a little bit of background on Advanced Energy United, for those of you who don't know, Advanced Energy United is a multi-tech industry association representing energy companies from across the spectrum. So that's everything from your large-scale generation, storage, and transmission down to the energy products in people's homes, and then all of the poles and wires and software that make the system work in between. So we work in a number of states across the country, in state legislatures, at PUCs.
I can jump in here, Paul. Like all little boys, I told my parents I wanted to work in energy policy, and here I am doing it, living the dream. And I've done it in a variety of roles throughout my career. I was at a utility trade association. I worked on energy tax and finance policy at a think tank in D.C. where I live. And for the last 12 or 14 years have worked in a variety of clean energy startups and technology companies, all of which have been focused on the customer experience of their energy usage and enabling electrification. For the past 2 years, I've had the pleasure of doing that at SPAN. At SPAN, we make the technology, both hardware and software, that enables load flexibility and energy management at the edge of the grid. And we can dig into that throughout the conversation, but think of our technology as enabling electrification and energy management, mostly for residential customers, but getting into some other use cases as well.
There are a lot of different ways to approach the problems that our power grid is facing right now. In the last episode of the Policycast, as I mentioned in my rambling intro, we talked about advanced transmission technologies and grid-enhancing technologies and all of the three-letter alphabet soup acronyms that accommodate them, but really, sort of hard and fast ways that grid operators can get more out of their existing systems, but still involve some sort of installation and some time to get them figured out. The solutions we're talking about today, though, are on the demand side. It's sort of addressing the same problems, but flipping the script and looking at it from a different angle. Sarah, I would love to start the conversation by kind of teasing out why this is so important right now. Everyone is seeing their bills go up. Everyone is hearing about data center controversies and debates. Everyone is aware that there's this affordability crisis percolating across the United States right now. What makes demand-side solutions so relevant, particularly at this point in time?
Yeah, well, Paul, as you mentioned, we're sort of in this toxic mix of challenges right now for our energy system. It's the rising demand, it's the energy unaffordability, but it's also the aging infrastructure and the increasing extreme heat reliability challenge that comes with it all. And there's really no easy outs for the system. Your listeners may have heard this before, but at Advanced Energy United, we have this 3-part framework to try to solve these challenges, right? We need to build more stuff on the grid to serve our needs. We need to make the grid more flexible and work for consumers. And we need to reorient our system around the affordability outcomes that we hope to see in the world. So that's build it, make it flexible, make it affordable. A lot of my day-to-day work is on that make it flexible bucket, which has 2 pieces, right? It's getting more out of the existing poles and wires because we just need more energy today to serve our high AC loads or our increasing electrification from vehicles or that new heat pump we just threw into our basement. But we also want to be getting more out of our existing grid so that we can spend less on energy infrastructure in the future. And all of this is really about getting customers more electricity at lower cost without breaking the bank. So that's why the demand side is so cool, and the demand side is extra cool because it gets to involve all of the people out in the world and all of the businesses and empowers them with tools to manage their own bills and support the system.
I think that's a good technological overview of why now. I would have a slightly different direction that I would go, maybe more of a historical direction. So I think about a unique confluence of factors right now. We have an affordability crisis that many of us feel on a daily lives. It's more extreme in some parts of the country than others, but everybody is feeling the pain of rate increases. We also have rapidly increasing demand from customers for energy to power their lives. So you feel that in electric vehicles and more electric devices within the home, but also things like data centers and large loads, just more demand for power. And then the third, and maybe getting closest, Sarah, to where you started, is the new technology that allows people to manage that while also delighting customers. In the past, we've had 2 of those at a time. Maybe one of those is always there, but we've had things like an affordability crisis paired with energy demand in the 70s, but we didn't have the technology to manage energy usage. In the 50s, we had really exciting new technologies, vacuum cleaners and televisions. And we also had a rapidly increasing growth, but we didn't really have an affordability crisis, partly because of utilization things that you've started to talk about. So right now we're just seeing a unique confluence, or historically unique confluence, of 3 factors that are making it the right time to talk about the grid edge and demand flexibility.
I think you make a great point, Richard. When you start to think about the way that our electrical systems were constructed, they were constructed very dumbly. And I know that's not the smartest way to say that, but we're talking about limited to no grid edge visibility. If a tree is down on a line, the line's not going to tell you. It's not going to scream to the utility, hey, a tree fell on me. Nowadays, that's not exactly the case. We have so much more opportunity to have an idea of not only how our system is performing, but how elements of that system performs together. And I think that, to me, is a great place to send you now, Richard, which is to talk about the grid utilization angle. And that's, a hot term right now, I guess. But it really boils down to the same sort of core themes that Sarah and I were referencing, and that's getting more out of what we got. Why is that such a hot topic right now?
Yeah, so let's start with the basics. People with fancy degrees will try to tell you that power prices are complicated, but in fact, they're pretty simple. It is a simple factor of how much does it cost to run the system in dollars, and then how many kilowatt hours you delivering over the system. That's like the throughput of the system. And if it costs less to run the system, or you deliver more over the system, you get lower power prices. And so utilization is about increasing the throughput of the system without commensurate increases in the cost of the system. And so I think that's intuitively pretty simple. And then there's some really good recent research on this. So for example, the Brattle Group, the consulting firm that I think many people here would know, has recently done a report called the Untapped Grid, where they found that a 10% increase in system utilization would lead to a 3.5% decrease in utility rates and save customers on the order of $150 billion over the next decade. So that intuitive, good thing of increasing utilization actually will lead to rate decreases for customers.
And Sarah, when you're involved with all of your stakeholders in these conversations, what are you hearing?
Everyone's excited about the load growth, right? This is a new opportunity to do something good for our customers. I'm excited about all the new EVs out on the road and the heat pumps in people's homes. We don't want to be thinking of that as an obstacle or a challenge to solve for, or something that's going to harm energy affordability. We want to be thinking of those as tools that make everyone better off in multiple ways in their day-to-day lives and on their electricity bills. So we love this as a conversation to put a positive spin on all of the crazy things that are happening in our world. Crazy in a good way.
Yeah, I think that's right, Sarah. Like, load growth is good. We want load growth. Like, without load growth, it's going to be really hard to lower rates. Now, you need to make sure that that load growth is not paired with proportional increases in system costs. And that's where our technologies come into play, and all of the many United member technologies come into play. But I think that Paul, that key insight of like load growth is good is important for people to hear.
That's not something we're talking about very often, or at least not framing it that way, Richard. You're often hearing about the downside of load growth, how we're not going to be able to get there fast enough. We need 2.5x grid, 3x grid, 4x grid. We need transmission faster. We need to accelerate nuclear and fusion. You guys are telling me, no, this is the direction that we need to be. Is it because it brings the capital to the table to actually invest in the grid in the way that we've maybe been putting off for a few decades?
I think that's an interesting take. I think it's more about just the mathematics that the way we're going to lower prices is by growing the throughput of the system. But again, I think where you were going with like bringing capital into the market is we need the capital to pay for the technologies to manage the system more efficiently. I think if all we're doing with the capital is paying for more poles and wires and building the same system that we already have, it's not going to work. And we are going to have like the affordability crisis is going to get worse.
That's a good point. Sarah, we talked about this a second ago, that these topics aren't necessarily new. You know, from your seat at the table, what has grid utilization meant classically, and what is the difference now, I guess?
Yeah, well, Richard brought a great historical perspective to start this off, looking back into the 20th century. But I even remember a few years ago, we had some early conversations when EVs were just starting to take off, particularly in California, about what is the impact of EVs on the drivers of EVs, but also on other ratepayers. Are EVs good for everyone or just the individuals who are purchasing them? And some research at the time found exactly what Richard already talked about. When you add EV charging load off peak, then you are passing more units of electricity through the poles and wires. You get to spread the fixed costs over more units of electricity, and all ratepayers benefit from lower rates. And if you haven't increased your electricity usage at all, a lower rate means a lower bill. So that is good for everyone, whether or not you're adopting these great technologies. Of course, we hope everyone does also adopt these technologies because the users get all these extra benefits. But that part of the conversation is not new and I think is widely recognized across the energy industry. What I think is new is this moment of extreme and rapid load growth and affordability pressure, sort of pinpointing this conversation. And I think what is new about the utilization conversation is that we actually want to start by measuring the system that we've got in a new way. Certainly, we don't know what the current utilization of all the poles and wires out there are at the different levels, the transmission, distribution, which has several different sort of locational and geographic elements to it. Maybe the utilities know, but us as outsiders to that system have no sense of where we are today and haven't spent time to articulate what is ideal utilization for our poles and wires and our system. And so the conversation is really about learning what exists, where we want to go, and then starting to put sort of metrics and tracking systems and reporting systems in place so that we can move ourselves into that ideal state.
Yeah, I think the policymaker engagement on the topic is what's new. So we've always known about the economic theory of utilization. And Sarah, you're right. Like we started to get into the technology, and the technology has been here for a couple of years now. But what we've seen in 2026 is state legislators and state regulators and executive offices, governors' offices saying, we want to proactively take action to increase utilization in our state. And so a good example of that is the state of Virginia legislature passed a bill to measure utilization, create some metrics, and then ultimately is asking the utilities to propose plans to increase system utilization appropriately. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of, I think that transition from interest to action has been really exciting to me.
Sarah, is there any more in the policy space that you want to hammer on? This is the Policycast after all. I want to leave that door open for as long as possible. It does seem like this is a new and evolving space where there really hasn't been as much thought into how this might get put into legislation and enforced. But I'm curious, what those early conversations have been like, what kind of language you've seen used, and what's working, what's sticking, what's not.
Yeah, I think at these early stages, Richard pointed out the Virginia example, that is the state that has gotten furthest along so far. And now folks in Virginia are really rolling up their sleeves and asking, how do we design the metrics and the tracking system to implement that legislation? We also know the governor of New Jersey is really interested in this topic and has asked the Board of Public Utilities to take this on through their sort of regulatory powers. And a number of other states are also exploring it. And we expect a lot more action coming up in the 2027 legislative sessions. There's a lot of work to do, and I think a lot of folks are really excited to do the work to craft the actual details of this. Again, as a system of measurement, it is a little bit new and it is complicated, and we can talk about some of those complicating factors, but we need to be able to do complicated things today to solve our challenges and have a lot of really smart minds thinking about how grid utilization fits with all of our other initiatives to make the system more effective, efficient, and sort of working for consumers.
Let's get our hands dirty, Richard. Do you want to get into some real life use cases and what exactly this means? I mean, the metrics are probably pretty tough to establish. We've been speaking pretty obtusely about technologies and metrics, but we're talking about real stuff. We should talk about the real stuff.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Maybe a helpful way to think about this is think about like every piece of equipment, every meaningful piece of equipment on the electric grid. Think about a transformer, that round cylinder that sits on a pole in your neighborhood. Think about a substation. Think about a transmission line. Think about a power plant. All of those things have what's called a nameplate capacity rating. And that is basically like, what is the theoretical limit on how much energy could be pushed through this piece of machinery on the grid? A good metric might be something like, what is the actual throughput divided by the theoretical throughput limit? And I'm going to get in trouble if I try to do math involving the 87, 60 hours in a year here. But
we made you promise no math on this show before you came on.
So we don't need to do that. But I think like you can imagine something that's like actual throughput divided by theoretical throughput limit. And maybe that for one piece of equipment it comes out today to being 50%. Now, I think what we're also going to find is that the goal is never going to be 100%. I think if you tried to get to 100%, you would run into a bunch of different challenges. It wouldn't work for utility planning. It actually would not be good for the equipment. That theoretical limit is very theoretical. It's not really a safe operating limit. There's all sorts of stuff about like operating equipment, letting it cool down at night so you get more out of it during the day for transformers, stuff like that. So I think what we're trying to do is establish some of these metrics. And I think like total actual throughput divided by theoretical limit throughput is a good metric that could be applied pretty broadly across the grid. You want to measure at each individual piece of the grid. So think about like a distribution system feeder is a piece of the grid, a substation is a piece of the grid. And then it's up to regulators, utilities, and other stakeholders to determine what is the right limit here? What is the right utilization amount? It's probably not where we are today for many pieces of the grid, and it's certainly not going to be 100%, but should we adopt a goal of increasing utilization by, say, 5% over the next 5 years, something like that? And where would we get? So I think that's where the conversation is. And Sarah's right. The rubber is hitting the road in Virginia. That's where they're going to define metrics like this and the goals attached to those metrics.
Maybe as Richard brought us close to, but not into the math portion of the metrics, maybe I'll give some real life technology examples. And Richard, I'm sure you have some to add here. But to make this really real for your listeners, think about a school district that wants to adopt electric school buses because the total cost of ownership is lower and they want to provide clean air for their students and they want to lower the ambient noise in their community, right? All of those things are great. These buses are mostly going to get used fall, winter, and spring. That is generally for most of the utilities in the country, not when their grid is peaking, which is to say they have spare capacity to push more electrons through to new devices and new things out on the grid. So that electric school bus, as it charges, sends more electricity through the system and lowers rates for everyone. And that's awesome. We can think of a similar example with, say, heat pump water heaters. If you're converting a gas water heater to a heat pump water heater, that is new equipment that uses new electricity. That is a really manageable device because you can heat up your water heater during the middle of the day when there's tons of solar available. And then you can choose to not heat your water heater during peak hours when that would drive sort of the need for new investment on the grid. So consumes more electricity, but doesn't add to peak. Great, you've increased your grid utilization.
Paul, if I could add another technology solution here, I think Sarah's right with those descriptions of like the EV charging and the new appliances in the home. So taking one short step backwards, the way the National Electrical Code has historically told contractors and homeowners how big they need to size their electrical system is by assuming that every load in the house, every appliance in the house operates at the same time. And so what that has meant is that there are a lot of older homes, not even old homes, but like a little bit older homes that have 100 amps of service coming into the home. And when those homeowners install a heat pump or an EV charger or an induction range, a contractor will typically tell them you need to increase your electric service to 200 amps. And that's a surprise to the customer because then they have to call the utility and the utility says, well, you actually have underground service and we're going to have to jackhammer your driveway to install that. And it can cost like tens of thousands of dollars and take a long time. The alternative solution is what SPAN has been building, and that's our smart electric panel solution, where the panel automatically manages the demand in the house at the appliance level or the circuit level. And then it keeps the home within its 100 amp. If there's a 100 amp home, keeps it within that 100 amp limit. And where this really gets interesting is not only have you kept that very far edge of the grid at the same limit, But then as utilities think about how big does my transformer that feeds this neighborhood need to be, they can keep that at the assumption that that home is still at 100 amps, so you don't need to increase the transformer size. And of course, at scale, that all adds up to bigger substations and things like that.
I think those are great examples. I think it should give the listeners and viewers an understanding of what it is that we're talking about exactly here. Now, the math and the metrics, you still got me lost on. I assume it's easier for everybody else, though, once they get some of that stuff figured out in Virginia and can sort of disseminate those ideas to others. People can figure out what works and what doesn't. It's always easier if someone does the heavy lifting for you first. The way that I feel like I hear this conversation framed up the most is probably an overly simplified version. That's if we could just, give me 50 or 100 hours of the absolute worst peak demand of a given electrical system, and if we could just worry about those hours and not build the whole system for those hours, but handle them separately, it would change a lot of things downstream, especially for you and I and the ones that have got to send big checks over to the utility companies. Shout out to JCP&L, just got my July electricity bill. If there was just a way to isolate these peak demand hours, could we quantify in some way how much more we can get out of our system?
Sir, I can start here. I think it's a good mental model, Paul. I think the one nuance here is that not every part of the system is going to peak at the same 50 hours. So you're going to have maybe some parts of the distribution system might peak when the rest of the system, they might peak at night because everybody is charging an EV charger and is charging at that time. Whereas other parts of the system might peak during the day when air conditioning is on, something like that. Or some parts of the system might be more residential customers. Some parts might be more commercial customers. So I think the one nuance to your very good mental model is different parts of the system might have different peak periods that we need to manage.
Yeah, and maybe what I would add to that, we like to think of this as sort of a two-pronged approach, right? You increase the kilowatt hours during the times that the system is underutilized, and you try as much as you can to put downward pressure on the system peak, or at least avoid making the peak worse. And there's a whole additional set of metrics that you might craft, for example, to manage the peak. I think, I'm trying to remember, last year, Brattle did a separate study in New York that found some grid flexibility potential that equaled, I think it was 25% of the 2040 net system peak demand level. And that is a number that you can grab onto and say, utilities, go out and sort of amass a portfolio of resources to achieve that 25% of your 2040 net system peak demand so that you have an arsenal of tools to deploy to either push that peak down, shift the energy off peak, or avoid the peak going up. And that's critical for sort of system cost containment in the long term. And these two things pair really, really nicely together because it's actually a lot of the same technologies that both increase your utilization during off-peak hours and manage your peak demand. So maybe to harken back to the example I gave of the electric school bus, we just talked about how if you convert a diesel school bus to an electric school bus, you're selling more electricity. Those buses, because they transport school kids, sit idle during the summer, and they're just big mobile batteries. So if you have a utility program that enables that school bus to feed electricity back to the grid as part of a vehicle-to-grid component of a virtual power plant program, right, that can help manage the peak that the utility needs to build out their generation, transmission, and some distribution infrastructure too. So now you've solved two problems. You've increased the throughput and you've prevented additional spend on the system.
Flexibility is a word that I keep hearing throughout this program, and it's also a word I've heard as close to a silver bullet solution as possible for data centers as well. Richard, how do data centers fit into this growing equation with more and more math with every stone we unturn?
Yeah, sure. So I think data centers are obviously contributing to load growth or sales growth, the throughput growth. So that should be a help for us. The problem is that data centers are not very flexible, and they Recent modeling I've seen shows that roughly 5% of the cost of a data center is energy. So they're not really sensitive to energy prices, and they're just going to use the data center for 100% of the hours as long as they can. That means that it's not really going to improve utilization because you have to build the system peak. So there are different ways to solve this problem. Some data center companies are starting to work with load flexibility, what I would think of as like beyond the fence line of the data center. So maybe a good mental model is like just paying a homeowner to turn down their EV charger or their heat pump during peak time, and it'll sort of look to the grid as if the data center was doing that. Maybe a more interesting example, though, is something that SPAN is starting to build. So we recently announced a product called XFRA, that's spelled XFRA, and this is our distributed compute product, where it takes that same concept of getting more out of the existing infrastructure at the home, but instead of getting more heat pumps out of it, for example, we're starting to deploy distributed compute nodes, so small collections of servers behind residential meters on residential properties, and then aggregating all of that computing power up and selling it to the people that need compute. So that might be cloud gaming companies, it might be traditional software companies, it might be AI companies doing inference. But we are starting to see a lot of interest in that because it's gets all the compute benefits of a data center without the energy challenges of the large scale data centers.
I feel like there's a stakeholder, and I use that word stakeholder again. I need to get a thesaurus out and start using new words. There's that stakeholder that's involved in every part of this conversation that we've barely mentioned so far, and that's the utility. I feel like none of these solutions can really be properly leveraged without leaning on the utility to figure out a way to make this hand talk to that hand. Sarah, what is that conversation like, and how do utilities feel about these demand side solutions in general?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think on the one hand, utilities are under tremendous pressure to find affordability solutions for their customers, right? They are struggling to get enough power on the grid as fast as their customers want it, just as much as all of the customers are struggling to pay their electricity bills. So since there's no easy solutions, I think increasing utilization and doing some of the near-term peak demand management are great tools that they have, especially with utilization, right? Utilities are built to sell electrons. They love selling more electricity, and utilization is totally consistent with that goal, right? Putting products out there that use more electricity. Great. They love that. That said, I think it's complicated, and utility motivations and financial incentives are a mixed bag that point in all sorts of directions. I think at a really sort of fundamental level, being measured on something new is always a little scary. It's a new test, especially if you've tied those metrics to financial incentives or penalties, which is not the stage we're at in the real world right now. We're setting up the metrics and the measurements and the baselines and the ideal conditions at this point in 2026. But in the future, it's possible that we want to incentivize utilities towards that ideal goal. I think grid operators are very cautious by nature, and for good reason. They've been keeping the lights on for a really long time and doing an excellent job at that. The results of this test might point towards slightly different management of the system than they're used to. So that can be a little scary. I also think, big picture, if we're doing our jobs right at managing peak, we are asking the utilities to build slightly less stuff. And given that their financial incentives really incentivize deploying as much capital as possible on real physical projects in the world, that does run a little bit in counter to what they're used to doing. And also some of the tools that Richard and I are talking about are software solutions. And those have traditionally not been quite as incentivized in our regulatory model as traditional sort of capital build. So all of this fits into a bigger conversation about what is the utility today, what is the utility we want in our future. But again, I actually think there's so much capital to be deployed right now that the conversation around utilization and peak demand management at the sort of lower down distribution system level should be welcome relief to utilities who can't do everything we need them to do fast enough otherwise.
We work directly with utilities in many cases. I talk to utilities every day. So I'll just describe two things that I hear from them. And I think they're both aligned with what Sarah said. One is that they have so much demand growth that they're not worried about where their rate-based growth is going to come from. They are just they are maxed out on their ability to deploy capital. And so they are actually looking for different solutions now. I think 10 years ago, it wasn't like that. 10 years ago, it was, you can imagine a utility exec running the utility via a spreadsheet and making decisions based on what's going to maximize the rate base. And it's not really like that anymore. I don't really think it was literally like that back then, but I think it was closer to it than it is today. The other thing that we hear from them is that the affordability crisis is a real problem. So think about in the oil industry, and I think most people here follow the oil industry just a little bit, but when oil is between $60 and $90, people in Texas are like, thumbs up, this is great news. When oil is $110 a barrel, they get nervous because people start to switch and people start to drive EVs and stuff like that. What we have now is the equivalent of oil at like $150, and people are rapidly finding alternatives, and it's making utilities really nervous. And so I think utilities want to get back to more rate stability, solve the affordability crisis, and it just makes everything else they want to do so much easier. I'll also add that we do a lot of work, not just like conversations with utilities, but we have business with utilities. So two programs that we have with Pacific Gas and Electric are, I think, indicative of what Sarah is talking about here. One is that they have started to deploy Span Edge, which is our at-the-meter span panel. It's a UL-listed power control system. And they are starting to deploy that to homeowners that request a service upgrade. So they're seeing immediately service upgrades are a challenge for customers. We can solve this more cost effectively for customers. Let's just start doing that. And the other thing that we've done with PG&E is aggregate those resources, all of the span resources on constrained parts of the system, and worked with PG&E to use those span resources, those span technology, to manage demand during times of system peak and when those specific parts of the system are at their peak. So distribution system management with our technology. I think that's all just a good example that utilities, this is not easy for them. They're not they're not all ready for it today, but I think they're all going down this way, and there's opportunities for them to work with technology companies to solve these problems and meet their objectives as well.
Part of the matter really complicating things for utilities is that this isn't the only conversation they're having that is a 5-alarm fire urgent conversation. How does this topic about sort of demand side solutions square with concurrent conversations about peak management, as you mentioned, Sarah, or meeting the energy demands of new housing?
There are a lot of different threads to pull in here. We've talked a little bit about how the utilization conversation is really complementary to the conversation around peak demand management. A lot of the solutions, a lot of the policies are the same. But I think on the flip side, as we were just getting to, utilities still have to build a lot. And we agree with that. There's still so much upstream infrastructure. And as Richard was just saying, I think it's very clear that utilities have capital out there to go out and build. And that's actually what's going to make them a little bit more favorable to these demand side solutions in the near term. There are some interesting interplays with the sort of utilization and peak demand metrics that we want to think about. We at United have a policy goal to make sure that the grid is ready for customer demand before the demand gets on the system, right? You don't want to be a business that has just decided to electrify your fleets. You build all these chargers, you call up your utility, say, hey, can you install this? Or can you energize this? And they say, oh, sorry, that's going to be 6 to 8 months because we just have to go upgrade this part of the system first, right? So we want to be building proactively to the need that we're quite sure is going to be coming soon. We want to be thinking about how building that extra capacity in the grid and that sort of near-term redundancy with the expectation that it gets used soon impacts the metric design for utilization metrics. Once you add capacity, your utilization is going to dip for a little bit of time. And I don't think it's anyone's intention to sort of disincentivize that sort of proactive planning and thinking. So we do have to consider how all of these things, the need to build and the need to use the existing infrastructure work together. It's not easy, but it's definitely possible. We have a lot of smart people working on this. I think similarly, a lot of states are having conversations about what to do with their more traditional energy efficiency and energy conservation programs. And we all here think it is still of critical importance to, where we can, have consumers use less electricity. That's going to lower their own immediate bills and help with that peak demand management. Got to be thoughtful about how that is fitting into the puzzle. And how we're funding that, and making sure that we're not creating new layers of disincentives to do that on the utilities. But it's part of what makes this a good project for a lot of folks. I don't know. The people who do this work, maybe they all like jigsaw puzzles too, because you get to search and find exactly the right piece. And it can be a fun task as much as a challenging one.
We talked a little earlier on the program about some burgeoning legislative efforts in a couple of states where we're going to try to get a handle on what it is exactly we're trying to improve and how. What policies, in your opinion, Sarah and Richard, do you think would be best to incentivize things like peak demand management or just better grid utilization in general?
So I think historically there is let me think of the right way to describe it, an instinct from policy advocates to describe the inputs that we wanted to see at a utility or in the energy system. And it would be something like, we want more renewable energy, so we will create a renewable energy standard that requires the utility to use more renewable energy. And those were really effective. We also saw virtual power plant requirements. We saw EV program requirements. We saw energy efficiency requirements. All of those individually have been effective, but what it's led to in many states is 50 different policies. I talked to a Northeastern regulator that said she was dealing with, I think, 30 different solar policies in the state. And they were all overlapping in complicated ways. And so I think we should get in a mindset of more outcome-driven policies. And that's what I think is I think part of what's capturing people's imagination about utilization is, we're not telling a utility how to do something, but we're saying we want to achieve an outcome, go figure it out. And my impression from utilities is that they like that more too. Now, I think what they would really like is, let's get rid of the 50 other policies that are input based. That's just not happening. But I think there's the instinct of new policy creation is likely to be more outcome oriented than input oriented.
I do think at Advanced Energy United, we do take that perspective, right? In setting good performance targets for utilities, we want those to be about the real world outcomes that we see. That said, I think we do like to think about the composition of the tools that utilities need to amass to help achieve those real world outcomes. And some of those tools include rate design, right? Creating more seasonal and time varying rates. We would love for that to be part of the toolkit that utilities have to achieve the real world outcomes. Managed charging and automated load management programs for EVs and EV fleets. And I think we like to see utilities enable flexible interconnection agreements, which allow customers to hook up and agree to use less power or no power at times when the system can't quite accommodate them yet. We love to see utilities standing up VPP programs as part of this toolkit to achieve the real world outcomes. We love to see them encourage customers to convert less efficient air conditioning or electric resistance heating to more efficient heat pumps, right? All of these things hopefully can be harmonized into easy programs to access for customers, and then tools that the utility can sort of pull on at different points in the time, depending on what's going to be effective to achieve those real world outcomes. I think one of the main points, and Richard, I think you'd agree with this, is we have to deploy the technology and get the things out in people's homes and businesses so that utilities have demand side energy to manage and flip the switch. And the more tools you have out there and the more devices and software and products you have, the less you need to depend on one individual customer and ask a lot of them to be responding to the grid conditions. And the more you just have millions of folks who hopefully aren't even noticing a difference in their day-to-day, they're just supporting the grid. So I think we agree with that sort of system and real-world outcome perspective. We do need to create the building blocks so that utilities have the tools and know what to play with. And then we need to get the devices out in people's homes or businesses.
I do agree. I think you just described everything, which is where the rubber hits the road, which is like, how is a utility actually going to change customer behavior and grid behavior in a way that increases utilization? It's a number of different things. I think another takeaway I have, and I think you started to hint at this, is it's not just going to be like calling customers and asking them to do something. There's often going to be a mix of hardware and software that enables the solution and makes it more dependable and what I call plannable for the utility, makes the load flexibility look more like a direct substitute for infrastructure investments. We see, I think that's especially true in the world of rate design. I think that an economist in front of a spreadsheet can design the perfect rate design that a customer would hate. And it would be perfectly cost reflective and a dismal experience. And I think that technology, both hardware and software, can help square those solutions so that perfect rate design delights customers.
Just to jump on, because Richard, I think you actually said something super important there. All of this is only meaningful. It's not only meaningful, but it is most meaningful when we have enough of it and are confident enough in it that we can incorporate it into our planning and operations design. And I think in the past few years, we've been in sort of pilot, get our toes wet, feel it out, see if this stuff works. And now we need to really plan our system around it, or else we're going to be doing the same old in spending customer dollars while sprinkling on these other fun tools. But what I think Richard and I are saying is that the tools are the plan, and the tools need to be central in sort of IRPs and distribution system plans and rate cases, such that we are actually displacing other money that customers hopefully now don't have to spend.
Yeah, I think the customer engagement angle is an important part of it. I've always heard that the auto opt-in method rather than the auto opt-out method is one way to get ahead of that, since most people think about their electricity bills hardly ever, a couple of minutes a year, I think some study said a few years ago. I also, I wanted to mention, Richard, I recently had a conversation with a vendor who does a lot of business in Europe and has been a part of their renewable transition over the past couple of decades, and had mentioned almost exactly as you described it, that's how they've been approaching problems lately. It's less the way that we handle things in the United States and more about solutions that are oriented around a specific problem. So grid has problem X. It costs ratepayers X dollars per year. If you and your company, Richard, can come and solve this problem for X dollars less, we will give you a percentage of whatever the money is saved. And now the problem has been solved and the ratepayers are no longer on the hook. The way that we've addressed those problems in the U.S., and we're not going to waste my breath trying to explain it all because I barely understand it, but has not quite been that way. Would you agree that that's sort of the way that we need to be thinking about the grid moving forward to best utilize these distributed energy resources in a way that is both measurable and impactful?
Yeah, so we should think of customers as a grid resource, not just as a user of the grid. And when you get into that mindset, and it sounds like you're talking with somebody that was describing a mindset like that in Europe, when you get into that mindset, you start seeing many more opportunities to manage the grid more effectively. And what I hope is that we do that in a way where customers are enthusiastic about it as well. I don't want low demand flexibility to be a burden on customers. It needs to be seamless. It needs to be a good experience for customers. One example of that is just the idea that a homeowner can add more devices in their home and then use technology to manage how those devices interact. So one thing that we do at SPAN is if a homeowner has a backup battery system and the power goes out, we have a tool that allows them to schedule which devices are powered by the battery during an outage so that nobody wastes their battery on their clothes dryer or something like that. Save the battery for the refrigerator and for the air conditioning. Don't waste it on other stuff. And I think that's a really positive experience. That's not the only thing the technology does. Most of the time, the technology is doing more traditional demand flexibility like Sarah and I have been talking about, but it's really adding significant customer value during specific times when the customer will notice.
Don't forget the 1,000 watts for the coffee pot, Richard. We can't leave that extra, the coffee pot behind.
You got to switch to cold brew, Paul.
Clearly. All right, guys, we're running a little short on time on the Factor This Policycast. But before we go, I'd love to get some final thoughts from each of you, particularly how this conversation continues to evolve in a time where I don't think any of us have really ever seen the electric grid, both in current state and where it's headed. We're at a time of utility reforms. We're at a time of discussions about energy abundance and nuclear nouveau. We're in an era in which renewables are making up more and more of the power generation on the grid. At the same time, we're rolling back incentives for putting them out there and rolling back energy efficiency measures and all of that stuff. It's a really complicated time, and math has become way more a part of the show than I ever intended. But if you could just sort of holistically take all of that information and square it with the conversation we're having today about demand side solutions, where does that leave you? Sarah, we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. It's a challenging time.
Dickensian time, the best and the worst.
The best and the worst, yeah. What we're seeing is extra high interest from politicians and from decision makers across the states in figuring out how to solve these problems, right? Energy has never been more a part of gubernatorial campaigns than it is right now, which is great because we feel like this is an opportunity to go educate a bunch of folks about these new tools that they haven't traditionally thought of as part of the energy system. And it's a new opportunity, particularly coming into 2027, with sort of open attitudes and sort of creative thinking caps on to go and do more of this good stuff. Big stuff is important to build, and we are trying as best as we can to make it easier and faster to build, but it takes time. Folks need solutions in the more immediate term, and the solutions are on the demand side, where it can be quick to install a battery in someone's garage or start enrolling their smart thermostat in a program that is going to allow them to use what already exists out on the grid to support the energy system. So these are the near-term solutions, and I think decision makers across the country are starting to recognize that, which is actually really exciting for us.
For the Policycast, I'll talk about politics for a second. So at the federal level, energy politics are a little theoretical or hypothetical. At the state level, though, they get really real. And that's because it's up to state regulators and state policymakers to literally decide how much power costs. They approve rate increases. They decide what the rates are going to be in coordination with their utilities. That state level politics is changing dramatically. So it's really like good alignment on we need to solve for affordability. And the way we're going to solve for affordability is with unique solutions. And we don't have all the solutions today, and we need to go find those solutions. We're also seeing where Sarah, I think, started to go is like some governor's races are being decided based on energy. We saw some Georgia Public Service Commission races being decided. Those are an elected commissioner in Georgia. There were some people that lost their seats because of rate increases in the state. So we're just seeing a really good and I think helpful, ultimately, political focus on energy issues that we haven't really seen in a while. And I think that's going to enable some unique solutions for us all.
And as the topic of this podcast would indicate, you, the listener, are now a part of the solution. How does that make you feel? You're not just a problem anymore. You're part of the fix, too. Go get that backup battery. The grid could really use it. All right, guys, I hate to cut you loose. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate you both for coming on the Factor This Policycast, presented in partnership with Advanced Energy United, to talk about the ways in which we can improve our grid. That's a limitless conversation, a cow that we're going to continue to milk for a really long time. Sarah, I love how you played with the ice cream remark I made at the top of the show, so I'm going to call an audible. We're going to end it. Favorite ice cream flavor? You got to think of one. Go. Sarah, you first.
Oh, geez. Can I give you two?
Yeah. Yep, you can.
Okay.
For the sake of time, we'll go with two.
So generally, I think walk into any shop, I'm a cookies and cream fan.
Okay.
We have a local ice cream shop in Fort Collins, Colorado, best city in Colorado, that does a salted honey flavor that is out of this world.
Richard, beat that.
I like it with salt, but I'm traditionally a vanilla person.
Just keeping it simple,
You can tell by my stiff nature.
I'm a Michigander. I need Superman, something weird you can't find everywhere else if we're looking for
something
a summer
blue
ice cream cone. Yeah, something that's going to stain my teeth and make me feel funny when I jump on a podcast and forget to brush afterwards. You guys, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much. If you, the listener, took something out of this, that's awesome. Please subscribe, leave a little feedback, a comment if you like. You could find this in the post on factorthis.com. You could also find it anywhere you get your podcast, the Spotifys, the Amazons, you name it. You can leave your comments and feedback there, and please subscribe there as well. Don't forget, we do this Factor This Policycast every other Thursday. Episodes go live at 6 a.m. I hate saying bi-monthly because that could mean either thing. So every other Thursday they come out. So keep your ears and eyes tuned for the next one of those. Until then, take care of yourselves and your grid. Be good, people.